Hi everyone and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Paul Adepoju and I'm the community manager for the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. And we've had a lot of webinars that are geared towards improving the reporting skills and general reporting experience of journalists across the world, especially in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And today is not an exception, as we will be looking at a very important issue that COVID-19 pandemic has actually brought global attention to. Prior to the pandemic, it was really, really rare and quite unique for science-focused stories to be able to grab headlines. Normally, science-related stories were usually restricted to one of the deep inner pages of newspapers and just a side note on major news websites. But COVID-19 has changed the ecosystem as weeks upon weeks, months upon months, and over a year now, COVID-19 has consistently been on the front pages of newspapers, which actually shows that science-related stories can actually grab their attention. But it's not every scientist or every journalist that are able to interact with one another easily, and that is why we are focusing on how COVID-19 has actually impacted science communication today. And we have an expert that has been training and striving to close this gap between scientists and journalists long before COVID-19. His name is Dr. Charles Wendo, and he's the training coordinator at SciDev.net. Dr. Charles, how are you doing today?
I'm okay, thanks. And how are you?
I'm really, really doing well. Thank you for joining us. So,
Good.
before we go into Dr. Charles' presentation, I would like to inform you that if you are joining us on the Zoom platform and you have any question, endeavor to use the Q&A option on the Zoom platform to quickly get your questions across. And if you are joining us on the Facebook live stream, I encourage you to put your comment in the comment box below the live stream, and these questions will be put together, and we are going to communicate and discuss these issues with Dr. Charles after his presentation. So without much ado, I'd like us to go into Dr. Charles' presentation, and I'll be back with questions and interactions. So Dr. Charles, we are ready for your presentation.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Stella, and thank you, everyone, for joining. Good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are in the world. I am glad to meet you today. My name is Charles Wendo. I am the training coordinator with the SciDevNet, and my background is that I am a veterinary. I trained as a veterinary doctor initially, and then I joined journalism. So I have done reporting across, various science issues, health, agriculture, environment, and so on. But I have also been an editor at a higher level, where I was handling more than just science. So my view tends to be broader than just science journalism that we know that we talk about always, and which is the reality actually in the media. So I will shortly share my screen. Sorry, please bear with me for a minute. Okay, great. There we go. So today we are going to talk about reporting the science of COVID-19. There's a lot to talk about COVID-19 and the media, so we thought we could narrow down the discussion to reporting the science. And this is going to be the scope of the presentation. We will talk about some key definitions so that we are all on the same page. I will then talk about an overview of science and the media so that we all know if we are reporting the science of COVID-19, we know why we are doing that. And I hope at the end of the day, I convince you about something that I would call people-centered science journalism. And then we'll talk a bit about how the media have covered COVID-19 so far. And then we'll point out the various, point out the skills for science, the reporting the science of COVID-19. I will specifically make a mention of a course and a practical guide that we at SIDE have put together, hoping that it will help journalists to do the reporting of the science around COVID-19. The first definition I would like to look at, again, this might look basic, but it's important that we all look at it because I've heard people talk about science journalism, and to a number of people, science journalism means, to different people, it means different things. Science, my favorite definition is the one of the UK Science Council. They look at science as the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world, following a systematic and methodology based on evidence. Now, I bold the keywords, the pursuit and application, because you might have heard this debate on who is a scientist. Some people argue that the person who is applying science, for example, a medical doctor in a clinic, is not a scientist, but the person carrying out research and producing that knowledge that that doctor is using is the scientist. And I like this definition because we look at scientists across the board. It includes those people that produce knowledge and those people that make use of the knowledge. So I thought it's very important to come to an understanding on that. Again, many times when we train scientists, we ask them the question, why do you carry out scientific research? And they give us so many reasons why they carry out scientific research. And I'm not going to read them one by one. But if you look at all of those reasons why scientists carry out scientific research, you come to one conclusion, and my conclusion is there in blue. It's all about people. I am trying to build a case to convince you about people-centered science journalism, because science is about people. And in the next slide, I am going to convince you that journalism is about people. Again, my favorite definition or description of the purpose of journalism is the one of the American Press Institute. And they say here that the purpose of journalism is thus to provide citizens with the information that they need to make the best possible decisions about their lives, their communities, their societies, and their governments. Again, this puts people at the center of this definition. I highlighted the keywords here. Citizens, information, and the American Press Institute emphasizes verified information. And I think anybody who teaches journalism around the world will emphasize verified information, because that is what distinguishes between the media, between journalists and anyone out there who puts information on social media, on the internet, because we have a system of verifying information. That's why even when people have seen something on social media, they will come to us for verification. Again, the needs. I bold that, sorry, I forgot to bold that one, but yes, information that people need to make the best possible decisions. Again, That builds towards my argument about people-based science journalism, because you put a lot of emphasis on the information that people need, as opposed to simply reporting because scientists have come up with research findings. So it's important that we emphasize, we focus on the information that people need. And again, towards the end of this discussion, I am going to talk about very briefly, I mentioned the global trends and where journalism is going in the future. And if you look at the trend, you conclude one thing, that journalism in the future, not only science journalism, across the board, journalism is going to become, everything is going to become more competitive. So journalists need to learn to write stories that people want to read. Now, there is you need to work out how to combine what is important and what people want to read and what people need to read. That is going to be very important in the future, because there's going to be competition in the media. There's going to be competition for audiences. And it's very important that we write or we produce stories that people want to read. Again, the information that is going to help people make decisions. Again, I bold the word decisions, because sometimes I think we do exaggerate the power of the media. We do not actually decide for people, but we present information to them, and that information influences their decisions. So our job is to put the information out, but we have very little control over how people make decisions on the basis of the information that we provide them with. So I will okay. Again, to emphasize this, the issue of people-based or people-centered science journalism. Again, I put this chart across here to emphasize the relationship between science and society and where the media comes in. Now, scientists, they create and apply scientific knowledge. But the scientific knowledge that they create is not just for them. Citizens need this information. And how do citizens get this information? They will get it from the media. So the media then is a very important link between science and society. So our role really is to provide that information to society. Now, someone will argue that we don't simply provide information. We also, have a critical watchdog role and fostering debate and so on. But my argument is that even when we support debate on national issues or international issues, our role is to provide information, and people can then use that information as the basis for debate. Sometimes we also, or many times we also moderate debate, yes, but again, our role there, even when we moderate debate, information is at the center, because debate is about information anyway. Then the policymakers and the general public, their main source of information about science is really the media. The scientists know how to get their scientific information, but the general public and the policymakers, to a large extent, their main source of information is the media. Now, how have the media performed in this role? How have the media reported on COVID-19? Now, I spent a bit of time looking at so many reports about how the media have covered COVID-19 around the world. And I couldn't go into the findings of each one of them. So what I did is to pick out the most important findings, especially the ones that cut across the different studies. And these are some of the main issues that come out. One is that there was until, and there still is a high volume of coverage This increased rapidly in the first few months of 2020. The first half of 2020, there was a rapid increase. And then after that, there was a decline across the world. And many people were, many people criticized the media for reducing the volume of coverage at a time when COVID-19 was still or is still a major problem. And my argument is that, look, we should thank the media uh, for giving COVID-19 a lot of coverage, because just imagine without media, without journalists consistently reporting on COVID-19, where would the world be? And again, it's not easy to sustain the interest of the audience in on one topic for a long period. In any case, the rapid increase in the reporting on COVID-19 meant that other topics were marginalized. So after about 6 months of this, the media across the world started then to get back to giving a little bit more space to other topics without necessarily abandoning COVID-19. And that, I think, in terms of the volume of coverage, I think we have done, the media have done very, very well. So I would clap for every journalist who is here for doing that. But also, a number of these studies are stating clearly that for most people, the media have been the main source of information on COVID-19. Again, we are doing a great job there. But then you find that there is a heavy reliance on official sources and very little questioning of these official sources, which is an area where we need to improve, because media coverage, media reporting needs to have more diversity than just the official sources. I know a lot of journalists are doing a very good job sourcing the stories very well, but the majority have tended to rely on official sources. Then there's a lot of numbers-based reporting, the death toll and so on, new cases and so on, with without much interpretation of these numbers. What exactly do these numbers mean? You must have heard about the expression that the role of journalists is not to simply tell us that it rained yesterday or it's raining now, but to also tell us what does that mean? Why is it raining? And if it is raining, then what are the implications and what does that mean for me? Do I lose or gain anything? And how do I position myself for that? So there has been a tendency of doing a lot of numbers-based reporting, and also event-based reporting with literal interpretation. So that is, I better package it as an area of improvement rather than a criticism, because the fact that we are reporting is already good, but those are areas where we can do a bit better. And again, a lot of the stories were straight news, and like I said before, generally event-based. And again, I make the argument that, and a lot of other people would make that argument, that we can do with a little bit more enterprise journalism and independent, stories that originate from independent, independent queries, story ideas originated by the journalist and then leading to a story. And the other thing is that most stories are on the socio-economic impact of COVID-19, and then there's less reporting of the science. And another bullet point that I missed to put here is the fact that a lot of the sourcing, the people quoted, a lot of politicians quoted, a lot of executives quoted, but there's less quoting of the scientists in these stories, which partly explains why the stories are more socio-economic science, which is okay. But my argument is that we cannot ignore the socioeconomic impact, because that is where COVID-19 is felt most. But we need not separate the socioeconomic issues from the science. Now, what I see is you see a number of stories that are focusing on the socioeconomic impact without bringing in the science. And you also see some stories that are discussing, that are talking about the science, the research findings, without bringing in the socioeconomic aspect. And my argument is that a good science story should be about people, should not be just about scientific discoveries. A good science story should be about people as much as it is about science. Okay, so what did we do at SciDevNet? In the very early days of COVID-19, we put together a practical guide, how to report the science of COVID-19. And we are going to share the link. I just placed the link at the bottom of this slide, but I will share it before this webinar ends. It's basically putting together the basics on COVID-19, but also what are the key issues that you need to look out for when reporting on COVID-19, and what are the sources of information and stuff like that. So we're going to share that. Some of you may already have looked at this practical guide. On average, it takes about 4 minutes to, most people who have read it, they have taken an average of 4 or 5 minutes to read it, but you get a lot of information in 4 or 5 minutes, and you can always go back and get more information on it. Then we also put together an online course. Again, the title of the course is Reporting the Science of COVID-19. Again, we shall share the link. There's a lot of useful information in there, and we can't share all of it right now. But in the next 10 minutes, in the next 8 or 10 minutes, I'm going to quickly just mention the highlights of the things that you can find in that online course. One thing I need to mention is that we put up this course at the very beginning of in the early days of the pandemic, and you may find that a few videos that are in there might need updating. For example, by then we did not have vaccines. Now we do have vaccines. We intend to make that that update to make it more relevant. But I'm just mentioning that in case you find a video that's talking about COVID-19 prevention and it's not mentioning vaccines, just know that it's because it was done before we had vaccines. Now, the first module, and again, there are so many points in there and I will not go through all of them. I will just mention the first module is basically bringing you up to speed with this whole issue of emerging respiratory viruses. And we thought this was important because to report effectively on COVID-19, you need to know a little bit of the virology, but you also need to be able to follow the research findings, and you need to be able to link then the science and the socioeconomic issues. So, so there are some very basic things here about COVID-19, mentioning that the virus that causes COVID-19 is not the only one of its kind. There are many other such viruses, but then one thing that we point out in that module is that it is not going to be the last. Most likely, COVID-19 most likely won't be the last, because when you look at the trend for the last so many years, we've been having new respiratory viruses emerging every so many years, and that led to the coining of the term disease X, which we talk a bit about in the online course. Now, disease X is that disease which is going to come caused by a virus that we don't yet know, and will have symptoms that we don't yet know, but it is predictable that that disease is going to come. Before COVID-19, the concept of disease X was already existing. And when COVID-19 came, the scientists were like, oh, so this is the disease X that we've been talking about. Now, COVID-19 has come. There's another disease X that we don't yet know. It will most likely come at a certain point. Then the second module is about sources of COVID-19 scientific information. Now, in the module, I have not projected it here. We mention a few research databases because you can't just, it's a topic where you can't just go to Wikipedia or do a general Google search to get your information on COVID-19. You need you need verified information, because that is what our audiences expect of us. So we point out there ways to get verified information on COVID-19, but also we point out where you can get the newest research findings on COVID-19. So it's quite important that we get information from verified sources, but also that we know the fact-checking tools that are available. So in that course, we point out those fact-checking tools. And then the final module is on packaging the COVID-19 story. And we think we repeat here the issue of verifying the information, the issue of fact-checking, but also we emphasize that when you get information from scientists, you need to be clear about what is scientific evidence, what is an opinion, because there's a difference between the two. Many people have an opinion, but their opinion may not necessarily amount to scientific evidence. So that is quite important. Even when we are citing articles that are published in a scientific journal, it's important that there are a number of people that may be interested in advancing their own agenda. So they get an article published as an opinion, which is not necessarily peer-reviewed, and then they come around to front that as scientific evidence. So we need to know the difference between a peer-reviewed and a non-peer-reviewed section of a scientific journal. And then we also point out the fact that when we are selecting scientists to interview, it's important to know that the qualification of the scientist, because not everyone is qualified to speak about everything. You might find a professor of surgery, he may not know enough about the virology of COVID-19. So it's important to know the credentials of the scientist. But also the other thing, we point out that when you're finally packaging your story, after you've gathered all the information that you need to gather, it's very important to package the information in a simple language, in a language that people can understand. That will not make your story trivial. It only makes your story more understandable to a wider audience, which is what journalism is about. We don't do journalism for scientists. We do it for the citizens, for policymakers, and most of these are not scientists. And then so avoid jargon, and if you must use certain scientific terms, then you explain them, using statistics sparingly, using as few numbers as possible, and so on. And then we also mentioned that you need to package the story in such a way that it is interesting. Most people will find it interesting to read, because like I mentioned earlier, in the future, it is going to be more competitive. And there are many reasons. The Reuters Institute published a report on the future of journalism, and due to time, we are not able to share the findings of that report. But some of the things that come up is that getting revenue for the media is going to be more difficult than in the past for a number of reasons. Then there's going to be more competition for audiences for a number of reasons. So you need stories that people will want to read. Then on top of that, there is also going to be something called news avoidance, which some of you may already have heard about. We have more and more people who will want to avoid the news media, and we have to give them a reason to come back to the news media. So it's very important that you package a story that people are going to be interested in, and one of the ways is make it a people-based story, which is why I am making the argument, and I'm going to consistently argue for it, that science is about people, journalism is about people. So we need to do people-centered science journalism. That's going to be very important, humanizing the science story. Then the second thing that is going to be very important is that we find ways of relating the story to the issue that people are concerned about at that moment, to the topical issue of the moment. And the other thing that is going to be important is that we find ways of making our stories to address people's actual needs. The stories should address people's needs, because if I'm hungry and the story is addressing food, I am more likely to read or watch that story. We need to think in that direction so that we write stories that people will want to read. Because at the end of the day, a lot of people are going to tell you that editors are not interested in science stories. I do not believe that is true. No editor refuses a good story. So a good science journalist writes a story that people will want to read, and then an editor that looks at that story will want to publish it. So that brings us to the end of this discussion, and I say thank you very much. Now, I do not have the monopoly over knowledge, so I will encourage you, or possibly Paul is going to introduce that session. I will encourage you to share with us your own experiences. Tell us what you know that other people can benefit from, what has worked for you, what has not worked for you. But also, if you have a question, you can also ask the question.
Yes, thank you very much. And I really appreciate the fact that you were able to share some of the important do's and don'ts in science journalism. And like you rightly said, I can see some of our participants here already that are veteran science journalists. So if anybody would like to share any insights and you would like to talk, just raise your hand, and I can activate your mic so that we can learn from you. So just use the raise hand option and I will take it. I will let you be able to share your thoughts. And one of the things, some of the issues that really come to mind every now and then is the fact that many individuals that cover science stories are not really science journalists. They don't have science background. So I would like to know how important being able to having a science background is, and to a journalist's ability to cover a science story. But I would like to really know among participants how many people have a core science background. So is a single choice option. Do you have a core science background? The question is yes or no. And I don't know if Dr. Charles has seen the results of the chart of the poll. Most of our participants here are almost 80% do not have a core science background. So how important do you think having a science background is to a science journal, to a journalist's ability to report science?
I think a science background is useful, but it's not the most important thing. You see, journalism is first and foremost, science journalism is first and foremost journalism. So a science background helps, but it's not the most important thing. I think it's just 80% or more good journalism is what makes a good science story. A science background can help you to understand the issues and be able to find very easily understand the interpretation and so on. But I have seen great science journalists that never had a science background, and what they did was to learn the basics of science. For example, right now, all we need for someone to be able to do good reporting on COVID-19 is to have some very basic knowledge of virology, which someone can even get by reading what a virus is in the first place and what is this virus that causes COVID-19 and how does it behave. Now, you don't need to be a virologist to do a good story on COVID-19. You can learn that. And then you learn some bit of the epidemiology, the way the disease itself behaves. That can be learned. So in summary, yes,
Okay.
the point is that
Well,
a science background is not the most important thing. The more important thing is the interest to learn.
okay, thank you. So there's another question I would like to know. I would like to understand our participants' interactions. How frequent do they interact with scientists? So do you interact with scientists frequently? And so which simply means nearly 70% of our participants engage with scientists regularly. So another question that I would like us to know is the quality of this interaction, and especially those that are reporting science. So I would like to know if those that are reporting science consider it an easy topic to report. So do you consider science easy to report? The simple question is yes or no. Do you consider science to be easy to report? So Dr. Charles, what are your thoughts regarding this? More than 80% of our participants say, nearly 80% consider science not to be easy to report. So is this an issue, and what do you think still needs to be done to ease scientists' ability to report, journalists' ability to report science? Dr. Charles?
I think the more you interact with science, the easier it becomes to report. I have worked with journalists in the past that started, from scratch. They never had any science background. And then the more they interacted with science, the more they appreciated science. First of all, it's important to get to know how science works and what is science anyway. And then the basic thing called the scientific method, to know that scientists carry out research using the scientific method. And then once it has gone through the peer review process, that becomes scientific evidence. And then scientific evidence that is accumulated over the years is then what is known as scientific knowledge. Then once you get to know that, you get to know why it's important to make sure it is evidence-based. And then the more you interact with the scientist. Each time you interview a scientist, for instance, they say something that you've not understood, then you ask, what does this mean? If I rephrase it this way, would it still mean the same thing, and so on? So yes, the more you interact with the scientists, the more events that you attend, the more you read the scientific publications, the more you become familiar with them.
Yeah, thank you very much. So one last question that I have for our audience, especially those that have been interacting with scientists, is are you very comfortable with talking to scientists? Uh, uh, and if you are a scientist that you are joining us today, are you also comfortable with talking to journalists? Yes, we are seeing it, these going 60-40. Okay, let's get some more participants to share their thoughts. So, roughly, increasingly number of people find this relationship to work. And so, Dr. Charles, what do you think still needs to be done to improve communication and discussions between scientists and journalists?
I think we need to understand each other's side of the coin better. One of the things that make the interaction difficult is if I'm a scientist, I go to the journalist with the way I want things done. And if I'm a journalist, I go to the scientist with the way I want things done. Now, the more we understand each other's side of the coin, the better. And again, the more we have interactions between scientists and journalists, the better, because only then can we get to understand each other's side of the coin if we interact with each other more and more. I have seen people creating opportunities, for instance, for a journalist to spend a day or a week or a month at a scientific research institution, and a scientist to spend a day or so or more in the newsroom. Now, that kind of interaction is very useful, but even if you don't get formally organized interactions like that, at individual level, you can initiate. I don't see how you're going to do science journalism without having in your address book a long list of scientists that you can go to easily. So it's important to have those, just initiate icebreaker discussions so that you are in touch with the scientists, so that you're not just looking them up when you need the information. It's important to build rapport beforehand.
Yeah, so we have this. I'll take this question from one of our participants. The question is, what is your advice on how to report science to a public that is used to news on politics and corruption?
Just make it relevant to them. Because I'll tell you one thing. People don't come to the media. People don't open a newspaper to see what science story have they reported today. People don't come to watch TV to see what science story you have reported today. People have their lives to live, and they watch the science story to the extent that it feeds into their lives. They come to the newspaper to read the science story to the extent that it feeds into their lives. So make the science story a story that is relevant to people. And the three things that I mentioned, how do you make science story relevant or relatable to people, to most people? You link it to the interpretation of let's say you are reporting about research findings, you link the interpretation of those research findings to the real issues that people deal with in their daily lives. That is going to be very important. But also, if there's a trending topic, you link the I can't remember where I saw this. For instance, someone carried out a study on coronaviruses in animals, and as soon as COVID-19 broke out, this person then released these research findings of a study they had done perhaps a year earlier. And at that moment, COVID-19 is the topical story. So this research finding that is related to COVID-19 then becomes relevant. So it's important that whatever we report in science is related to people's lives, and then the topical issue, and then And then actually in every country, there are things that people care about more than the others. You can come up with a list of the 10 things that people care about in your country. And that changes from time to time. So a science story that is related to the things that people care about at a particular point in time. You don't need to lobby any editor. Now, if you allow me, Paul, to tell a story of how I became a journalist, it was never in my plan when I was at university doing my undergraduate studies. I was happy to become a vet, perhaps doing veterinary field practice or doing veterinary research. That's what I thought I was going to do. And then when I finished my course, I immediately got a job with the University of Berlin. They had a project in Uganda, and but then they had a misunderstanding with the government, so that project was closed. Then the following day, I had a lot of time to myself, and then I started to put together an article about a water weed that was a huge problem in Uganda. I never knew anybody in the media. I went to the newspaper to submit my article, and it was published immediately. Why? And I usually tell this story for a purpose. Why did the editors publish this story immediately? One, it was addressing a major problem that people cared about at the moment. At that time, Lake Victoria is the biggest freshwater lake in freshwater body in Africa. And it has a lot of significance in Uganda in terms of water transport. It's the source of fish and so on. So this water weed was choking the lake. So everybody was bothered about that. So then I put together a number of research findings related to that, and I wrote an article out of that. So that kind of article does not need any lobbying. You see, you relate it to a problem that is on people's minds at that moment. So that article kind of opened the way for me. And along the way, I decided to abandon veterinary practice and get into journalism. But that's not the main thrust of the story. The main thrust of the story is that if an article is providing scientific information related to an issue that people care about, believe me, people will read that story, people will view that story.
Yes, thank you very much for that response. So there is another question from Kiran, and the question goes thus: how do we as journalists move beyond just sharing information, but using information to get the public to actively engage with science and extend it further with scientists? So, what do you think the role of, how do you think journalists can help in this particular role?
I think it comes down to audience engagement. There are various ways of audience engagement. Looking at, publishing stories, are doing stories that are not just one way, but you get the audiences also to feed in. I will give one example of a radio journalist that gets people to raise the issues of their concern, either on social media or face-to-face arrangements. Then they get that information, then they go to look, people raise their concerns. Then they get that information, then they go and look for the scientists to respond to that. And then they come back with a story that goes back to the audience. Now, that is just one example of audience engagement, but there are many, many examples of audience engagement. And the report published by the Reuters Institute that I mentioned earlier, they also emphasize on that the future is for media that can engage their audiences as opposed to one-way flow of information.
Yeah, thank you very much. So there's another question from William. William's interest is around accuracy of reporting on science focused issues. So the question is it good to let the scientists I interviewed read the story for accuracy before publishing?
Wow, that's a very controversial topic. when I was still active as a journalist, I think more than half the scientists that I interviewed tried to say that to me. And my answer to them was, look, the story that I'm going to write is not going to be just your views or your information. I am going to interview so many other people, and it's simply not fair to them that I write a story quoting so many people and I bring it back to you to read. I think it's not fair. But also the media house that I worked with at that time did not allow that, did not allow us to take the article back to the scientist. But even if they allowed, it is just not practical to take your article back each time to so many journalists, to so many scientists. So what I would tell them is that, look here, if you're worried that I might misquote you, this is what I'm going to do. At the end of the interview, I recap the main points, what I think I've got from you. And if you are satisfied with that, that is good enough. Now, I know that some journalists work with a media house that allow them to take it to, to take the story back to the scientist to review. But I think most media houses would not allow that.
So I'd like to push a little back on that. If you the way scientists, I think they are programmed in the way they go about their scientific writing. They usually believe that nothing should be changed. Especially when they are saying something, they always desire to be quoted verbatim. And in their own science space, they are used to some terminologies that the general public may not be aware of. And in the process of ensuring that the general public is able to understand what a scientist was trying to say during the interview in the main piece, journalists do try to use simpler words that may not be a perfect and accurate depiction of what the scientists had in mind. So, what suggestion or recommendation would you give journalists to ensure that even when they get a call and very difficult terminology and indices from the scientists, how do they maintain that accuracy when reporting it to the general public?
The one is about maintaining the managing the expectations of the scientist. It's important to explain to them that, look here, most people that we work for, that we serve, will not understand the scientific jargon. So it's important that we package the information in words that people can understand. I usually tell them, please think like a great scientist, but speak the language of the people. And if you have not spoken the language of the people, then I help you to turn that information into the language of the people. Now, sometimes it's a negotiation. I would then ask, you would then ask the scientist that if I say this, if I phrase it this way, is that okay? And you find an understanding, because a story that is loaded with the technical jargon, it's not going to be a story. It's not a story that is accessible to people. So it's
Now,
really, yeah, it's really, really important that we break down the jargon. We avoid and use alternative words, but there are times you really have to use the jargon, but then explain it, so that you don't leave people doubting. You don't leave them, you don't write a story for the public and then you leave them not understanding your story. Then you will not have done your job as a journalist.
so, whose role is it to do the breaking down and simplification of this? Is it like we ask the scientist himself or herself to say this thing in a simpler language, or we break it
So,
down and ask for confirmation, or we go and do it after we've conducted the interview?
it depends on who I'm talking to. When I'm talking to the journalists, I tell them it's your responsibility. And when I'm talking to scientists, I tell them it's your responsibility.
Okay, now I want to merge two roughly similar questions together. One is on the Zoom platform here, and the other is a comment that buttresses the importance of this question. And this comment was on Facebook, which is Chidera. On the Zoom platform, Rajan is asking how to identify fake scientists. And on the Facebook platform, Chira shared an experience in which she said that she had a scientist on her show, and in the course of the interview, she realized that she even had more knowledge on the concept than her guest. So, what do you think is the guide? What will you recommend for journalists to be able to identify really qualified persons and to also be able to spot scientists that are fake scientists and not experts that they claim to be?
I think perhaps the easier thing is how to identify the good scientists than how to identify the fake ones. But if I tell you about how to identify the good scientists, then perhaps that helps in avoiding the fake ones. Now, a good scientist publishes. And then, good scientists do research and they publish their research findings. And when you do look up their profiles, you will find, the studies under their names. You will also find they are cited by other scientists. But also, maybe before I even get to that, quite often, good scientists, not all the time, but quite often, good scientists will be working with a credible institution, a credible university. But again, not everyone working with a credible institution, or to put it the other way around, working with a credible institution is not enough for you to say that this scientist is not fake. But that's one of the good indicators. Is this person working with a credible institution? Do they publish? Do they carry out research and publish? Someone who has never published, I would fear to call them an expert on this topic. But also, you could see their names on, this WHO report, this national report, this, this and that report. You could see their names on it. Again, if you're in doubt, you can speak to other scientists. A lot of these many countries have academies of science, and these are groupings of scientists. They can actually help you to check. The other thing is that quite often it would be good to ask someone for scientific evidence. Someone is trying to advance a point of view, and then you ask them, but what is the scientific base? What's the scientific evidence that you base your views on? And if they can cite actual studies that have been done. If they are failing to cite any studies on which they are basing their views, then you begin to wonder. And then the other thing I mentioned earlier, which I'm again going to emphasize, is it's not enough to just say this is a fake scientist and this is not a fake scientist. It's very important to know the right scientist for the right thing. You find a social science expert advancing a very strong view on a scientific issue like a vaccine. And if a social scientist is expressing a scientific view on a vaccine, then they are perhaps not the right scientist for me to interview on that topic. So who is the right scientist for this topic? Now, that other scientist, the social science scientist, he's going to be, an expert in another thing. So you interview them on issues where they are an expert.
Yeah, thank you very much. Then we are already beyond the time allotted, but there is this very important question from another member of the audience that I would like you to ask, which is on the influence of science journalism itself on policy, especially countries and governments that claim that they rely on science for their for their policies. So the question is from George, and it reads thus: how much do you think the way scientific news are covered influence policymakers who claim to only follow scientific facts?
I am not sure. I would need to see what we know. What we know for sure is that policymakers take the media seriously. But again, it depends on which policymaker you are talking about, because there is something called selective perception. There are people who will read what they want to read. You know, if there's this research finding that doesn't tally with their beliefs, then they will ignore it, and they will pick the ones that tally with their beliefs. Those ones are there. But to a large extent, the media do have an influence on policymakers. I can't say exactly to what extent, because not everything in the media is going to influence a policymaker. Yes, but yes, I think the world over, policymakers do pay attention to the news media.
Yes, there is also this question that COVID-19 actually brought to attention, which is alternative facts and selective fact choice in reporting. And if we look at countries like the US, where many things have become highly polarized and politicized, including the vaccine itself, we see different individuals that have already made up their minds using now handpicking science facts to justify and back their position, and which actually means the mindset is that whatever you are looking for, you will be able to actually see something or a report somewhere that is well aligned with your beliefs. So how do you think journalists can carry out their activities and not feed into these stereotypes and be caught in the web of using their reports to justify individual school of thought that did not have anything to do with science from the outset?
I think not just me thinking. It is true that science journalism is evidence-based. If you ask me, it's not only science journalism. I think rather journalism is an evidence-based profession. We should report facts. Fact is sacred. But it is even more important in science journalism. Science journalism is evidence-based. So I would rather we focus to a large extent on facts. Now, I know there are scientific controversies, there is scientific debate, which we can't lock out. But even when we promote scientific debate in the media, that debate, I think, should be based on evidence, some kind of scientific evidence. And where does scientific evidence come from? It is from research findings. So if someone is advancing a viewpoint, I would want to ask them, where are the research findings on which your viewpoint is based? So that is
Now,
important.
yeah, so as a wrap up, I'd like to know, what do you think um, journalists still get wrong that in their reporting that you think COVID-19 has really, really highlighted in their science reporting?
Well, I think the issue that I started with, no, I didn't start with it, I possibly mentioned it in the middle, is to find a lot of stories that not focusing on not giving us enough of the science. I think as much as possible, even when we do a story from a social perspective as our starting point, I think it's very important that that story should have scientific evidence. And I think that is one direction that I would like us to go more into, to find stories that are based on scientific evidence, which requires us to know where to get this scientific evidence online, because there's a lot of information circulating online which doesn't amount to any scientific evidence. but which some journalists could very easily believe, and they could very easily go in that direction. Now, before we close, very quickly, I wanted us to mention the issue of false balance. Uh, False balance is one of those ways in which journalists can very easily, promote false perspectives. You find the issue of vaccines, for instance. Then you're going to find a scientist, not one scientist, many who are vaccine skeptics. Now, I don't know if vaccines is the best example, but on any issue that you're reporting on, you are going to find people who are advancing alternative views, but which are not based on science, not based on any scientific evidence. It is okay for people to have alternative views, but as much as possible, let these alternative views be based on scientific evidence.
Okay, then when you look at the controversial issues that have really, really divided um, topics like vaccine hesitancy, even we see in some countries where some individuals, like you mentioned, when you are trying to separate opinion views from real hard fact reporting, but we are seeing the lines increasingly getting blurred between opinion views on some major news platforms that are also sharing similar time slots with news reporting. For the general public, while core journalists may be able to say that, okay, this is an opinion view, the individuals that are looking at the TV, reading these publications, may not be able to quickly separate and delineate this. So, what do you think can still be done to be able to clearly make these clear demarcations so that people's lives are not threatened, especially when opinions are dabbling into scientific issues?
I think we just need to do our job. I think we just need to do our job as journalists. I mentioned at the very beginning that there's a difference between journalists and any other person that places information on social media, on the internet. We have the element of verification. We need to verify our information so that we maintain credibility, so that if someone has seen something on social media, they will come still to the news media to check whether that is true. We need to maintain that credibility. Once we lose that, it's the only thing we still have now, because a matter of putting information across there to people, anyone can do that. It doesn't have to be, people don't have to come to the media to find new information. The only reason people come to us, to the media, to the news media, is they know that we have a system of verifying information. And as soon as we begin to publish people's opinions that are not based on any evidence, then we are going too close to the other people who just place unverified information on the internet. And along the way, people cease to see the difference between us and other people who just create information without verifying. So the issue of evidence, I cannot emphasize it enough. Scientific evidence, evidence, and evidence. So that
Yeah.
even when people are debating, that debate must be based on evidence.
Okay, if I'll call this my last question for you, it's on the fact that if you look at COVID-19, even though journalists are reporting COVID-19, they are also living in the reality, because we have many journalists that actually tested positive, while some journalists have already died of this pandemic. So, as an expert, do you think personal in the course of trying to gather evidence and to be independent and not let personal views influence reporting, do you think that is still realistic, considering that everyone, including journalists, are living in the reality of the pandemic? And how do you think we can actually utilize the fact that we are also living through this experience to improve and not introduce bias into our reporting?
My media trainer, my very first training in journalism was in-house within the media house before I did postgraduate studies in journalism and communication. So my trainer in the newsroom told me one thing I still remember, that you have to stay safe so that you are able to write the story. And that applies in whatever we do. We need to keep safe. This pandemic, this disease is dangerous, it's harmful. So we need to do, and we know the prevention measures, we need to do everything that we need to do. But there are times even when we know that we can individually take the prevention measures, sometimes we deal with the real situation of lockdowns. And those are the realities we live with. Journalists are actually reporting under very difficult circumstances. But in the difficult circumstances, people have found creative ways of continuing to do the story. It might not be as good as being able to go out there and get great stories, but I have seen reports about journalists innovating, doing more interviews on WhatsApp, for instance, creating groups of people on social media and creating a discussion around a topic, and forewarning them that the the views that we expressed here will be used in a story and so on. Yes, so there are creative ways that different journalists have been able to be able to do a good story even under the very difficult circumstances.
Yes, so thank you very much. So, as we wrap up, I would like to know your last remarks, whether you have any suggestion, any comment for our participants, and actually, I'm trying to chip in a last question. So, uh, so the last question I have for you is that what do you think the next science communication, science journalism would be for the next pandemic? Let's say the next pandemic, which many scientists say is unavoidable. Let's say it happens on the next 1 year or 5 years. What do you think will be different that time from the COVID-19 experience?
I think COVID-19 has taught us that every journalist needs to develop some basic ability to report on a science topic. It has always been necessary, but it's more necessary with COVID-19. You go to parliament and a report is being presented or an issue is being debated of a scientific nature in parliament. Now, someone needs to be able to report that science, and so on and so on. So it has always been necessary that any journalist that is reporting news or reporting a story needs to have some basic ability to report on science. But that is more important now, and we need to be ever more always prepared to report on a scientific issue, which brings me back to the argument that universities should actually begin to teach some elements of science journalism within the mainstream journalism course. But even for people that don't have that opportunity to learn in the journalism schools, they can learn on their own some basics, but they can also, we have an online course, for instance, done by SciDev. It's called Science Communication Skills for Journalists. So it's important that every journalist has the basics. Now, COVID-19 found many people unprepared to report science. And I think right now, compared to 1 year ago, there are more journalists now that are able to report science than before. So the next pandemic, if it comes, some people say it is when and not if. So when the next pandemic comes, I think it should find all of us better prepared to report science. That's one. But also the other thing is that since you asked me to mention any final remarks, I will repeat the issue that science is about people and journalism is about people. So we need to go in the direction of people-centered science journalism. And the other point I would like to raise finally is that you don't have to be an expert in the beginning. You don't have to have a scientific background. You can start from somewhere and become an excellent science journalist without a scientific background. What matters is the interest to learn.
Yes, thank you very much. So the interest, like you said, is what is important. Once the interest is there, resources and access to information, they are quite ubiquitous for you to improve your science reporting skills. And the online courses that you mentioned, I took one or two myself, and they were quite really important and useful. So I would encourage you to take that as your starting point in improving your science journalism skills, especially considering the fact that it's not a matter of if, but when the next pandemic comes around, you are better prepared as a journalist to be able to report it. So I would like to appreciate Dr. Charles for being quite resourceful today, and I would also like to appreciate every member of the SciDev team that participated in these in putting this together and in attending this webinar today, and each and every journalist that joined us from different parts of the world. I also appreciate you for taking out time to be part of this quite intuitive and very useful session. And from all of us, if you would like to access more information, more resources on science, on the COVID-19 reporting, I will encourage you to actually join us on the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum's Facebook platform. Just go to facebook.com and search for ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum and join the Facebook group. And we have more resources for journalism for you on the IJNet platform. So you can check them out by visiting www.ijnet.org. And if you would like to know more about the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum, I encourage you to visit www.icfj.org. Join us next week for another very important and exciting webinar, which the focus will be on the Delta variant. We all know about the Delta variant. Available data shows that it is actually aggressively driving the third wave across the world. But really, how much do you know about the Delta variant? So we'll be having a bioinformatician who will be breaking the Delta variant and other COVID-19 variants down for us. So join us same time next week for this important and educational webinar. So I want to say thank you for joining us today, and have a lovely day. Thank you, and we are out in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Bye, everyone.
Thanks and bye-bye.
Bye.